This is the fourth and final panel, and it features two distinguished scholars. So first, the title of the panel is Investigating Theory. Our first presenter is Dr. Kiran Phull. And Dr. Kiran Phull is a lecturer in international relations at the Department of War Studies in King's College, London. Her research centers on the politics of global knowledge production and the rise of opinion polling. She takes a critical and interdisciplinary approach to the study of public opinion, focusing on the ways that epistemic technologies, polls, surveys, population data, create and shape the conditions for governing social and political life. Previously, Dr. Phull was a postdoctoral fellow at the London School of Economics, where she received her PhD in IR, exploring the history of scientific inquiry into Middle Eastern publics and the emergence of local emancipatory methods and practices. And the title of Dr. Phull's paper is Knowledge That Counts on Polling and the Reclamation of Public Opinion in the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Phull.
Thank you. So does this work okay?
Yes. Maybe move it.
Share the screen.
Oh, on the share screen, that's right. Yeah, I can do it. So we'll do here. Yes, here we go. Okay, I think that should be good.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just want to echo again and say thank you so much to the organizers for today. This has been incredible, not only for how you've organized it, but also for creating such a supportive space. It's been a really lovely day, so thank you. And yes, so this is the title of my talk. And what I guess the underlying research question that propels this talk is the question of who claims the right to produce data on Muslim publics and by what means. And this kind of question, is it loud enough? Okay. This question underpins a lot of different facets of the way I approach my research. I tend to focus my analysis on the nature of actors. So actors being people who conduct research, methodological practices, and the underlying epistemological assumptions that work to bring publics into being. So by doing so, I interrogate the broader field of public opinion research. And this builds on my doctoral research, which was on the pursuit of Muslim public opinion in history and then contemporary times. And currently, much of what I do focuses on exploring critically the sort of various methodological practices that have emerged to try and know the region, to know people in the region, paying particular attention to things in history, like colonial investigative commissions, Western anthropological surveys, methods of mass social canvassing, and then modern opinion polls. And this involves quite a bit of archival work into the history of polls on the region or surveys and studies, those sorts of things. So all of this work that seeks to identify, classify, and then represent individuals and communities in the Middle East, I'm interested in unpacking the sort of statistical construction of the region from a more historical perspective.
Try to make sure folks are staying on Zoom. They're having a little bit of a hard time seeing the presentation, so I will try again. And it might not work, but we'll give it a shot.
Or I think just stop the share and then.
Oh, stop the share, yeah. Let's try that again. Okay. Stop the share again. Let's see here. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay.
Okay, so here it's, for some reason here it's not. It's frozen for some reason on the Zoom. So let's try it. Let's try this here. It's not really showing up here. If I change slides, no, that's so strange. It's not changing slides on the Zoom.
How about you need to do a little projector thing on the side?
Let's see here.
Yeah, down.
Oh, you mean this
Yeah,
one
yeah,
here?
yeah.
Let's see if that works. Unfortunately, it's not working still. I'm just gonna share the screen as is. That might be the best bet. Let me do that here. I'll go share screen. Here we go. And yes, now I think. Oh no. Now this is frozen. So let me get out of this. And then I will.
Maybe we might, is it gonna be okay if we just had the general PowerPoint, like that one up there?
Let's see here. I think this might work. Yeah, I think this works. Now, will it change slides? Yes, it works now. Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
So sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Thank you. In this talk, however, what I want to focus on is more of the contemporary global sort of economy of polling in the Middle East. And then in the spirit of the conference, ask a more normative question, namely, when we have polling, right, if it's typically polling, survey research, sort of large end studies, this is typically characterized by aggregative statistics, reductionist assumptions, and essentialized interpretations about opinion, then how, in the case of the Middle East, might this be overcome? So the talk sort of proceeds in 4 parts. I'll just speak a little about the statistical construction of this concept that emerges at a point in time, labeled Arab public opinion, concept we saw quite a lot in the media, and then the premises and assumptions around that and sort of the critique I bring to it. And then I draw on interviews. I'll explain that process as well. So interviews that I conducted with pollsters and practitioners situated inside and outside the region whose work specifically focuses on measuring Muslim public opinion. And so these interviews reveal sort of competing perspectives on what exactly public opinion is, and I think that's sort of interesting. So I'll speak to that. And then I'll focus on one of those views in particular, which is that polling is something that is emancipatory as a form of data activism, specifically looking at the case of Palestine to understand how this form of activism can take place and does take place through polling. And then the conclusion more sort of raises questions rather than answering any, but around the possibilities for decolonizing this idea or decentering away from this construct of Arab public opinion. So a lot of these headlines will maybe be familiar to you just in terms of maybe not the actual headlines, but just this sort of the bombardment of headlines on data on the region over the last many years. And my research sort of interrogates the hegemony of polling as it sort of sits in all of this. It's responsible for this to some extent, or at least implicated in it. And so I tend to take a more critical, more Foucauldian approach towards public opinion, thinking of it as a site of power relations, something that needs unpacking. I sort of interrogate the logics of calculation and quantification, the way that practices and performance are imbricated in this act of polling and basically surveying, and how these processes can sometimes be rather extractive, but together they work together. To sort of order political life. And I consider how these practices of ordering and assigning identity to entire regions or groups, how that comes to also reify certain things, the region or the politics of the region, how it makes it so. And so the point of departure here for me has been this. It's been the construct of this idea of Arab public opinion, which has become increasingly prevalent in media and political discourse, particularly in the post 9/11 security environment, when there was, and this has been sustained to some extent, a general fixation around monitoring the tides of opinion among societies in the region. This was very palpable. And then, of course, looking at opinion polling as the specific technical means of doing so. And so I can speak, there's a lot to say around how this sort of emerges, and I suppose I maybe won't go into it here, but one thing to say is that I was interested in the extent to which a lot of this data that's being produced, how much of it is a sort of foreign construction? How much of it is an indigenous construction? What are the kind of politics of this? Is there really a binary there? How does this sort of field actually play out? And I'm interested in it because numerical data itself is, as I see it, a site of power. Theodore Porter calls this kind of numerical data one of the most pervasive forms of power in modern state systems. And it's responsible for our perceptions, it's responsible for how we think and talk about people, about regions and whatnot. So I give it, well, I approach it quite critically in that way. Now, what I want to focus on is something that came out, it was unexpected out of my doctoral research. So in this way, I conducted about 53 semi-structured and in-depth interviews with pollsters and practitioners located both in and outside the region. So this was conducted between 2016 and 2018 here in the United States, quite a few interviews, but also in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Qatar, in Israel, and in Palestine. This allowed me to sort of identify the field, but also talk to each of these pollsters and practitioners about their approaches to their practice. What is it that they think they are doing? How do they approach it? And one of the questions I sort of asked everybody, which really nobody could answer so satisfyingly, was, what is public opinion to you? Most people didn't really have an answer, but what I gathered was characteristics. There are different kind of characteristics that are ascribed to it. And there were three sort of dominant discourses that emerged, and these are all people who are working specifically producing data on the region. Three that emerged here. So the first that emerged was that public opinion is something that is fundamentally scientific. So it has epistemic and political authority. It's deeply rooted in its own sort of sense of objectivity and accuracy. It's a scientific concept and we can rely on it. And so that was one dominant discourse that emerged. A second was that public opinion is something very malleable. It's a social construct. It's not a fixed science, but rather it's an approximation of representation. It's the best method that we have. It's something more like symbolic politics. It has the potential to shift and change. And so we must account for that. And then context and interpretation matter. And then the third discourse that emerged was that public opinion is something radically different. It is a tool for emancipation and empowerment. So both the empowerment of communities and individuals and for the study itself. So the actual science or study of opinion itself. And so here, expertise, knowledge become forms of political activism. Data itself is seen as a public good. So I'll speak to each of these in turn a little bit and then focus on the third, which was particularly illuminating. So the first discourse that emerged, and I'll give some sense of where this came from. Again, these are international sort of perspectives I was gathering. So this is that public opinion is scientifically objective. So polling is tied to objectivity, to rationality, to a value neutral position on the part of the pollster. Pollsters are not partisan, they're not part of the political process. Their role is to observe and measure and disseminate. And these pollsters who spoke to this kind of discourse draw attention to the soundness of their methodologies, the reproducibility of their results, and their research design. They're trying to convey scientific accuracy. There's a strong confidence in their methodology, and it's part of, I mean, this emerges as part of a broader sort of, the rise of statistical thinking through the 19th and 20th centuries. And I interviewed a pollster here who said that very much so polling emerged here out of a sort of missionary zeal to do statistics. So there's a great enthusiasm for the tools, the technologies of polling, the actual method itself, exploring what that can do, building on that. So a focus on the techno-scientific aspects of this practice. And public opinion also is considered then in this way, from a very positivist perspective, as something that's real and it's out there. It can be captured, it can be standardized. It can be standardized with specific methodologies, with confidence. And these methodologies are accurate, they produce facts, facts are objective, objective objective facts legitimate the field. And what this really means is that these pollsters producing data on people, on publics, on the region, this speaks to their relationship to that data, that what emerges is real. What we see is real. My findings on this, and like I said, these are dominant discourses. I'm not going to sort of name names as to who kind of had these views, but one of the things that was common to practitioners who shared this view was that they were producing highly policy relevant research. So their research was really interacting with policy, often a lot of privately commissioned studies, a lot of studies for government and whatnot. So high stakes that they needed to believe that their data was really accurate and real. That is still a working hypothesis, but that's what sort of united this group. And then among this, the second sort of group who emphasized that polling is socially constructed, talked about its changing nature. So it's fluid, and we know it. We know that it's not perfect. We know that there's no real agreement to whether it is true or not, but it works and it's the best that we have. And so pollsters in this realm, they see polling as sort of one tool in a larger gamut of things, in a larger sort of realm of knowledge as to what we can tap into. This meant that polling wasn't always the only method they used to ascertain opinion. They would also toy with sort of qualitative research, mixed methods, different approaches. There was a sort of acceptance that polling is one of many tools that we have. But what was interesting here is that there was a common thread that what happens to data once it's produced is out of their hands. So the pollster is exonerated from how data is interpreted. Data is produced and then it is put out into the sort of public sphere, and then the ways in which it is interpreted, it has nothing to do with the pollster's position. So by clearing up questions about their own neutrality, pollsters effectively exonerate themselves from responsibility for the data. They are inculpable, and they are determined to remain value-free and nonpartisan and not politically part of the project itself. So, as I mentioned, there was a kind of, I guess, acceptance of mixed methods, which means that pollsters in this light were more interested in sort of understanding, I'd say understanding opinion rather than measuring it, as in the scientific view. And so I think that those who expressed this view generally had sort of mixed feelings about the usefulness of polling, but one thing that united this group was that their research or their data was very much, there were private studies, there were government studies, but a lot of it was public facing. And this is why they sort of need, I suppose, to defend themselves from any sort of critique against their data, their methods and whatnot. And then this third group was particularly interesting because polling here was talked about very differently amongst another subset of pollsters, that it is much more than a mere aggregation of attitudes that have not been reflected on. It's about larger processes of debate and discussion in the public arena. So this third discursive tone that emerged understood polling to be a form of civic emancipation. So these pollsters don't prioritize the scientific soundness of their studies, nor the objectivity of data, nor the perceived utility of their data for private interests, nor even really the methodology and the technology, not such a sort of fixed sense of attachment to those things, but rather what they focused on was public opinion as a tool that could be used by people for the betterment of their societies. And it is emancipatory in the sense that it procures the right for representation by different groups. So the data, the knowledge here itself is seen to have an increasingly central role in political life, and public opinion becomes something that is more normative, closer in kind to the sort of ideal democratic concept that it is. And I can say that I had very helpful conversations with those involved in the Arab Barometer initiative around polling as a means of empowering the region, particularly, and as we saw, earlier in the keynote through transparency. So transparency of data being one of the key ways to sustain polling as a helpful as opposed to a reductive act. One thing that's interesting about this group is that it was refreshing to see that neutrality takes a backseat. It's not about the neutral scientific observer anymore. It's about public opinion practitioners as being leaders as also having a stake in the political setting, but describing themselves also as to some extent as influencers. They can choose to operate from particular vantage points and advocate for political causes. They're attuned to local politics, they're agenda setters and whatnot. So here, public opinion in this sense is a public good. It's something that belongs to the people and simultaneously enhances their collective well-being. And so on these three views, just to say that there's a diversification here, and what it reveals is there's sort of nuanced epistemological positions. And this counters the idea that pollsters are just one uniform group, that polling is just one uniform act, that in fact it takes many different forms, and that I think in particular, when looking at how to reclaim data or knowledge on the self in the region, that we can look to these nuances here. So what was interesting, or maybe expected, but where this sense of emancipatory polling really emerged was in the case of Palestine. And so my interviews and meetings and sort of observation of practice here really spoke to this theme of emancipatory polling. So and this is a quote here from another source, but someone that I spoke to with the same sort of message, doing this sort of emancipatory polling work. So within Palestine, the study of public opinion has flourished since, well, before this, but especially since the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. And indeed, all of the actors that I identified in the region emerged very much from 1993 to 2007. And so you see people, practitioners whose careers really began during the process of negotiations with Israel. So far from neutral observers, many of these people, these pollsters, were participant in these multilateral discussions around peace and security, and they had a personal stake in Palestinian self-determination. So that meant that polling was always an inherently political act. So from inception, opinion polls were seen as part of the civil sort of society process, a way to influence leadership, a way to engender change. And so pollsters then have worked to create a sort of civic culture around polling. And from what I gather, and I'd love to do more research here to understand the effects of this, that by primarily seeing themselves as activists, they have a different sort of relationship to the people, those that they seek to understand, measure, and whatnot. And it is this sort of normative dimension that makes the Palestinian case particularly interesting. And one thing that I've looked at in my research, which I would again like to revisit, is the localization of methods. So the way that something as standard as a method of conducting a poll becomes sort of localized, it changes and adapts to the local context, changes to kind of things happening on the ground. And one example of that, for instance, has been, especially in the Palestinian case, there are many unique challenges, but for one, an environment of sometimes missing information. So one thing that has come of this research is that everyone I interviewed agreed that Palestinians have developed their own capacity to get data. This includes creating their own territorial and urban maps, their own sort of self-identifying documentation, which means that these pollsters were more than that. They were also negotiators. Their role required them to be proxy demographers, social scientists, build relationships with NGOs, international institutions, those who might help them procure information when needed. And so their role has really been quite varied and multiple. And some other interesting sort of things come out of these interviews, which again, I won't expand on here, but just to mention of the many interviews I did, polling is a very highly masculinized field. And this was the one case in which the possibility for a feminist approach to polling emerged, what that looks like, not only in the context of making space for women in the professional field, but also to build in to the very kind of active measurement itself, more of a nuanced understanding of hierarchies, of power relations, of how calculation can be reductive and how to get around that. So a more eclectic approach to methodology. And so the Palestinian pollster's position is certainly unique, unexpected when we think of pollsters in the abstract. And a couple of them said this, that they have always operated from the Palestinian perspective and for the Palestinian cause. And this is very different from many scientific pollsters who treat their profession as a sort of neutral science, as a natural science more than a social science. So again, I'd love to understand the effects of this one day, but just to conclude, this was a sort of offshoot of some of my research from these interviews. What I'm thinking more and more about now is what does it actually mean to be methodologically decolonial or to decenter ourselves from sort of dominant practices in our methodology, especially with respect to studying Muslim public opinion, but this can also be applied elsewhere. And so the other two questions there to leave us on is how does, and this is something I'm quite interested in, obviously, how does power operate in global economies of polling in the region? How is that changing? And it is, very much so. And how can it be overcome? And then how can the production of opinion data be transformed into a participatory and emancipatory practice? And I think we have a very good case study for understanding how the localization of methods do this. I'll leave this off with a quote from Anahid al-Hardan, who questions the legacy of colonial epistemologies in Palestine. So he asks, how does the before and the during of the research come to bear on the after? And this is very much why I ask these meta-theoretical questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, Dr. Phull. Our next presentation is by a familiar person, and that is Professor Russell Lucas. And this is actually a joint paper with Justin Gengler. Dr. Russell Lucas is a professor of international relations in James Madison College and of global studies in the College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State University. His research specializes on Middle Eastern politics with attention to public opinion. Excuse me, public opinion, the sentence kept going. Public opinion, foreign policy, political institutions, and the media. Teaches classes on the politics and culture of the Middle East, as well as theories of global studies. He has previously served as the director of the Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities, and his co-author, Justin Gengler, was an associate research professor at the Social and Economic Survey Research Institute at Qatar University, and is currently a senior quantitative researcher in Seattle, Washington. He studies the micro foundations of political behavior in the Arab Gulf states using original public opinion data and survey experiments. Substantively, his work has investigated a wide range of topics and has been published in a number of journals. Which microphone would you prefer?
I'll take this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Will you be doing
That's a
PowerPoint?
very good question.
Yeah. Oh, you do have the PowerPoint, that's right.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to try sharing the screen here. So we'll do screen, and we'll do this. My calculations are correct. Let's see if I change the screen. Yep, we're good. Okay, great.
All right, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming today, both here in person and online. It's been a wonderful experience being with you all. I'm so happy you could make it both in person and virtually. in some ways, this project is a little, in some ways, kind of the inverse of Dr. Phull's, of kind of looking at public opinion data of how people are interpreting public opinion data. There's, this is part of a broader set of projects that I alluded to earlier. And so in brief, what we're looking at is a package of papers that are dealing with a project that's a survey attitudes survey, so a poll about polls, which ours was probably the first one done in an Arab state, and as far as we know, the second one done in the Middle East, the other one being of an Israeli study of Palestinians inside of Israel. So what we're getting at in this project is kind of taking a bigger step of looking at kind of how cultural globalization works. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the kind of different theories behind this, but in brief, there's kind of three views of how globalization has worked on culture. And one is kind of a growing homogenization of the world, or the notion of McDonaldization, that everything's becoming alike. And that in that alikeness has it underneath it a kind of rationalization process. And so in this view, as everything's becoming more efficient, more calculated, more predictable, and more controlled, survey research kind of gets viewed in this lens as kind of a form of technology transfer. That this is the expansion of social science from the developed world into developing states, either through a form of kind of modernization, of imposition, or of a more objectively neutral best practices. And I think, our grant proposal kind of captures that idea that, and of course this was done to get support from the Qatar Foundation's equivalent of the US National Science Foundation, that we were fostering a culture of research in Qatar, a study of public involvement and attitudes towards survey research. Now, the flip side of that argument is, on one hand, sort of an agreement that yes, the world is becoming more alike, but rather kind of emphasizing kind of the forcedness of this homogenization, that there is some sort of cultural imperialism, the imposition of cultural assumptions, attitudes, methods. And so instead of focusing on McDonaldization of form, it kind of focuses on the McDonaldization, or sometimes in the literature it gets referred to as the Disneyfication of meaning, that it all becomes homogenized under the rule of Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. And so in this view, survey research would be perhaps inappropriate for Arab Islamic cultural environment. And what's interesting is how I've heard this position from both researchers in a very Orientalist way, but also in a very Occidentalist way, that this is a foreign method. How could it be capturing our, meaning Arab Islamic identities and attitudes, as compared to Western researchers who would, well, these concepts obviously won't work in that environment. And then kind of in global studies, I think, kind of a broader family of ideas kind of fits into what we could call globalization or hybridity. That it is, for Naveen Patiris's idea, that mixing is what problematizes the boundaries in globalization. And so what we see is not either globalization or local, but rather some sort of mixture of the two, and that there is this particular local version of general phenomena in Robertson's view. And so, without getting into a lot of the theory, these are kind of the three frameworks we're working with. And so I'm assuming this audience kind of knows where the Arab Gulf states are. And in this, we're using Qatar as a kind of representative subset of the Arab Gulf states. Admittedly, it has its own particular take on kind of the general Arab Gulf state, rentier, small population state. And that it has been kind of the Arab Gulf states, probably the most open and innovative in allowing and kind of even using survey research. And so our project that my co-author Justin was mentioned, Mark Tessler, who we'll be hearing from shortly, and Jonathan Forney, formerly of George Washington University, were the project leads, but this was really done through the University of Qatar's Social Economic Research Survey Institute. And in that kind of this process of localization of knowledge is that the idea that this institute is developing a Qatari and Arab set of researchers who are kind of practiced in survey research. So this project is this paper, and kind of other a general survey attitudes paper has been published in the British Journal of Political Science, talking about conceptions of public opinion and how it is itself is defined. Is kind of one paper has been published on the linguistic and conceptual aspects of that, and the survey results on that we're working on. And then there's this project that kind of looks at globalization and the effects of it in survey research. So just a little bit about the sample and kind of the environment that it was taking place in. One of the interesting features of using Qatar as a research site is you can have both a national sample and a functionally cross-national sample, given the population that is 90% expatriate workers. And so the survey that we did was a national sample of all Qataris and then of white collar expatriates. We constraints don't allow the interview of and surveying of blue collar workers in Qatar, as probably the World Cup. You've probably heard about some of that. So we do have 50 or more than 50 countries represented in the sample. And so we had a response rate of 33% or 35%, which is kind of on par with most response rates in US polling. And so kind of how our sample broke down of 750 Qatari citizens, and then 500 Arab respondents, about 300 South Asian respondents, and then smaller numbers of Southeast Asian respondents from the Western states, Europe and North America, and then other respondents from Africa, South America, Japan, that we don't include in the analysis when we do that. So in this paper, what we were asking, we kind of assumed kind of in this debate between kind of technology transfer, cultural imperialism, and how survey research could be viewed. We kind of generally thought that the technology transfer view might be more prevalent. We figured that as the agents of globalization in Qatar, the expats would probably be more likely than citizens to view survey research as technology transfer. Also, given that survey research in Qatar at the time of our survey, in the academic and and anything outside of consumer surveys, was only about a decade old. Whereas the respondents who are expats might have been coming from countries that were more experienced with survey research. Whereas we also thought that Qatari citizens, especially given the kind of discomfort with some of the practices of globalization. I think once again, the World Cup brought out some of these ideas that Qataris may have been a little bit uncomfortable with some of the rapid changes going on in the country. And that would also reflect in kind of their views on survey research. So our three hypotheses that we went into the research with. And so to do this, we kind of created out of a series of questions, two indexes of variables based on sets of questions. And so our first index is composed of different elements in technology transfer. So you can read the specific questions there, and in general, how strongly the whole sample viewed that. On average, there's from 1 being not agreeing at all to 4 being strongly agreeing. For the most part, there was pretty strong agreement on these elements. What we do see is kind of a overall mean of 2.5 or so, with a standard deviation of 0.4. In terms of cultural imperialism, there was only 3 questions that we could turn into this index, participating in surveys is against Qatari traditions and values. Survey research methods have been imported from Western countries, won't give accurate results, and many surveys in Qatar are conducted for the benefit of foreign interests. And you can see that the general response is much less in agreement with these. So kind of in a nutshell, our inclination that technology transfer is kind of the dominant view is held out as compared to cultural imperialism. And so one of the things, of course, how does that break down across different types of respondents, whether they're from Qatar, Qatari citizens, whether they were expatriates who are from Arab countries, or whether they were expatriates from non-Arab countries. And so you can see the analysis of variance on our 3 different samples, and each of these does have statistical significance, that there are significant differences in the means between these 3 different groups. One thing I do want to note is that the 2 indexes are not correlated. They don't, they have an R of 0.2. So there isn't a correlation between these 2 indexes, but we do see statistical differences, significant differences between the various groups in their means. So that led us to kind of a more in-depth analysis using regression analysis, in which we said, okay, in comparison to Qataris, is there a difference on the indexes between Qataris and Arab expats, and then Qataris and non-Arab expats? And as you can see in here, there is a statistically different significant difference between Qataris and non-Arab expats, but not between Qataris and other Arabs, which kind of was puzzling in our thinking about kind of the effect of globalization of expat versus citizen. The only other really statistically significant result is kind of a weak significance on education, the greater education on the technology transfer index. And so this leads us kind of in our second and third hypotheses that we're not really finding support for that. And so we wanted to take a little bit more in-depth look at that. But other things such as having participated in the survey recently, gender or age were not significant. So taking that regression analysis, we could predict the average, and here's, we broke out the non-Arab expats into Western, South Asian, and Southeast Asian categories. And once again, you can kind of see a very clear agreement, disagreement, but also you can start seeing a lot more, whereas there's not a lot of variation in the technology transfer index, the imperialism index has a lot greater variation to that. And so to kind of give an example and kind of drill down a little bit, I think the evidence can be seen a little bit here of kind of comparing the two questions that surveys in Qatar conducted for the benefit of, if it was Qatar itself, that's part of the technology transfer index, where in the green and in the orange polls or surveys are conducted for the benefit of foreign interests. And so, you know, we can unpack this a little bit in, obviously, there's just much more agreement with this kind of technology transfer idea as compared to this imperialism idea. But also the kind of grouping of kind of Qataris and Arabs from other Arab countries as compared to the non-Arab parts of the sample. And how that agreement and these are the percentage of the respondents strongly agree, is for technology, for Qatar itself, Arabs had a much higher response to that than non-Arab, but also South Asian is a little bit higher than Western or Southeast Asian respondents. And that also parallels with kind of a foreign, that the polls are benefiting foreign interests that are barely agreed to in Arab respondents, regardless of citizenship, higher. And once again, we see kind of South Asian respondents kind of having a higher agreement as compared to Southeast Asian and Western expats. Do keep in mind the number of individual respondents of Western and Southeast Asian are roughly, you know, just a few dozen respondents out of, you know, roughly 700 people. And so the other interesting aspect of this is, of course, the percentage who strongly disagreed with the idea that participating in surveys is against Qatari traditions and values. And so we see this similar pattern here, but one of the other things that we notice is in the non-Arab parts of the sample, it is the Westerners who have the least strong disagreement with this statement. And so, whereas South Asian, Southeast Asian are, you know, more expressing more disagreement, but the Arab respondents, you know, majorities of them strongly disagree that this is something against their traditions and values. And so, trying to wrap up, kind of our hypotheses kind of in a kind of nutshell, that we did find support for our first hypothesis, but the other two we did not. And so instead, what we found was that this kind of cultural geographic division, that there was a significant difference of Arab respondents, regardless of nationality, from non-Arab respondents, both in agreement with the technology transfer and disagreement with cultural imperialism. And this is kind of then where we kind of have to come back to this kind of theories of globalization. That, interestingly, you know, we kind of find that it's not necessarily just the response to the survey, but also then kind of thinking about this, while these two processes are not part or correlated with one another, what's going on? Well, this is where the hybridity answer needs to come back into play, that we're not just seeing this kind of global homogenization, but rather what we, in kind of thinking about this project in relation to our survey attitudes and public opinion definitions, that the respondents, both Arab and non-Arab, are acting as active audiences in interpreting kind of these global trends in their own local definition. And it is interesting that our Arab respondents, regardless of citizenship, the item that they most strongly agreed with is it's important for leaders, or that leaders of a country have information about the views of ordinary people. Now, given that Qatar, as well as many other Arab states, are very non-democratic, and Qatar's polity score is a -10 out of -10 in terms of measuring democracy. So this lack of democratic institutions that we could be seeing that, and this kind of builds off of some of the other things we found, Arab respondents are actively using survey research and public opinion polling as perhaps possible substitutes for the input of public views into kind of the national political conversation. And also that non-Arab respondents are acting as active audiences to the environment that they are in, but also not necessarily belonging to in terms of Qatar. That it is kind of ironic that the group that derives the views of survey research as cultural imperialism, at least in Qatar, are perhaps Westerners themselves. And so, what does that say about those non-Arab and especially Western respondents in the environment that they're in? So I do want to kind of highlight that there's an alternative explanation that would be the language of the survey. The Arab respondents took the survey in Arabic, although one country did take the survey in English, but all of the non-Arabs were taking the survey in English. But we don't think that that's the explanation, because first of all, as I detailed in another piece, how we use the best translation practices, but also the fact that we're using indexes of multiple questions means that any linguistic interpretation may not, of the particular question, would be kind of washed out in the general index. Now, this builds on our kind of argument for hybridity in terms of that Arabs in general, both Qatari and non-Arab, have more positive views towards Arab than kind of, or more positive attitudes towards surveys than often assumed. And so that audiences are interpreting social science research for their own use in articulating views of ordinary people, when other avenues are particularly stifled. And interestingly, that non-Arab expats are perhaps holding a more reified view of Qatari society than the Arab respondents who have a linguistic and cultural access to it, and that kind of exclusion from the environment that they're living and working in can be, and perhaps often is, informed by neo-Orientalist tropes, cultural traditionalism, as well as kind of South Asian attitudes towards Arab society. And so despite the kind of rapidly globalizing economy and physical space, there are these cultural reifications that still exist among our respondents. And so, one of the things that we would love to be doing in the future is kind of, we don't have individual levels of cultural and political attitudes tied, because our survey was way too long to begin with. And one of the big findings of our survey attitude project is one of the things that Arab respondents like least about surveys is if they're long, which kind of parallels global attitudes. But also perhaps moving into this kind of mixed methods territory of kind of looking at qualitative research designs such as focus groups to dig into kind of how our respondents are interpreting the questions about how they interpret questions. So I'll close with that before Mohammed gets his big hook and removes me from the podium. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lucas. So at this time, we can open the floor for questions. For those of you who are participating through the Zoom webinar, you can type in your question in the Q&A. For those of us who are here, just raise your hand. There was a question in the Q&A, but the person who posted it noted that the question was answered as you were speaking. So,
Oh, okay. All right.
oh, there's a question right here.
I can speak louder.
That's okay. That's a good question.
This was very interesting. I have a question for Kiran on this area. That was really interesting. And you also worked on sort of publics, and I'm really interested, you use publics and public opinion. But the last few years, there are all these populist movements, whether it's right wing, Israeli or in India, and they are kind of moving away from polls, or they don't want to hear polls because they don't want to hear anything different from what they believe in. So how are you factoring that as these are well-known Habermas and all in public. So how are you figuring that stuff happening?
Thank you very much. Yes, so well, one thing that is interesting is if you talk to pollsters, many of them will tell you the method isn't dying. People are less interested in it at times, more interested in it around elections. It always sort of comes back in some form. And even if people turn away from it, even if there is less faith in polls, which we've seen many, many times, it still remains, and this is why I'm interested in it, it still remains the dominant social scientific method of understanding and ascertaining public opinion. And I'm interested in questions of measurement, and so it hasn't disappeared altogether. It still remains dominant in its own sphere. But yes, faith in the polls, reliance on it does change, that shifts. And while I acknowledge that they're not always relevant, but this is why I don't focus on data itself. I'm more interested in the assumptions that lead us to continue to use them and rely on them, especially sometimes because they benefit us or support our claims or whatnot. I find them to be very much tools rather than sort of factual things.
So by the way, it was not my intention to have a big picture of my face up there. Speaking of authoritarian regimes and whatnot, I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, other questions?
I have
Yes,
one.
Professor Kiran Phull.
Thank you. Both talks were very informative. I have a question to both of you, Kiran and Bassel, and that is what surprised you the most about your data?
Well, I think, there were a lot of interesting things that came out of our survey. I think especially for this particular paper, going into it, we were kind of thinking about along the lines of, kind of Qatar is a globalized space, and who's doing the globalizing and who's receiving the globalizing, kind of as it fits into this kind of rentier state mentality or political structure, whether it's political or cultural, in the Gulf. And so that, we were kind of, that's how we were expecting the results to kind of play out. But time and time again, there is something, cultural about, or at least there's cultural affinity amongst the Arab respondents, whether they're a citizen of Qatar or not, in a whole set of variety of results on how they viewed surveys as globalization, kind of general survey attitudes, and then in terms of kind of how they define public opinion. So this was kind of a result that I think we were, surprised to see.
I mean, it wasn't particularly surprising, but I guess it was interesting for me to just hear how strongly some methodologists and pollsters hang on to ideas like objectivity to try and equate their practice with natural science, using the language of hard sciences to kind of secure their authority in the field. And I think that sort of in defense of polls, in defense of the method, I found that defensiveness really interesting and surprising. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I just got a question here. Alina?
Thank you both so much for your really interesting talks and findings. I guess throughout today, a big theme that I'm seeing is agency and the importance of agency in the face of regime and regime change. And so I'm wondering if, for both of you, I guess this is the question, have you been faced with the conundrum of not trusting some things that people are saying because of judgment, because of censorship, and the question of whether people are sort of shifting their truths, or they change their mind, or they're not sure whether to actually expose their critique of a regime or something like this. I don't know if this has been a poll question, but if I think about Egypt, I can't imagine trying to do a poll about what they think about the system. So I was wondering if you guys have confronted this.
Who would like to take this one?
Well, yes, I mean, I really wanted to interview Egyptian pollsters or people who had previously worked, and I couldn't access them. And so there was a censorship, like I was in countries that I couldn't really get to speak to people. And these aren't even questions these aren't even requiring, everyday people to speak up against the regime or on the regime. This is just methodologists speaking about their job, and even that was very difficult because there are sensitivities around even doing this in places. So yes, that was based. And then trust is really something to kind of, when you're doing interview research, you have to build, and it's something that you negotiate, and this is why I'd love to return to the field and keep going back and keep understanding, because also things change so quickly too.
So I mean, I guess there was kind of three parts to the answer to the question. I think the first one is we were doing this survey in Qatar, not in one of the other Arab Gulf states. And so that, the state has created that space for educational and a certain sense of, allowing this research institute to exist. But also, our poll was particularly non-political as well, when you're asking a poll about polls. So we were asking, what is public opinion? How do you define it? But once again, these are not this is very far from that political red line. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how much of a dictator is the president? Is not what we were, asking. I think the other, so that's another element of this. But I think the other last thing is on one hand, I think in this gets into your talk a little bit of, the PIs on this project were 4 white American men. But yet the field workers were pretty much all Qatari or Arab or expat in Qatar University students. And so, and I know the Institute had done a lot of work on kind of interviewer effects of who's interviewing whom and how, and what were some of the, kind of ways to, kind of reduce bias in sampling in that way. But of course, that's also just viewing that in the terms of methodology as well. So That wasn't part of this project. I wasn't part of that, but I know that there's a lot of other work done on that, both in Qatar and kind of in the Middle East as well.
Did see a hand from our keynote, Professor Mark Tussler, who made it out from Ann Arbor. Glad you made it.
And he slid in on time.
On Qatar, in addition to what Russell said, this work was funded by a grant from the Qatar National Resource Council Foundation. The unit, the Qatar unit at Qatar University had applied for funds to do this to the Qatar Foundation and received the funds. So it was certainly not something that was imposed from the outside. Doesn't say that those aren't important questions. They come up a lot. They are good questions. But in this particular case, also one of the things that motivated the Qatar proposal was the population of citizens is very small. It's probably not even 300,000. And if you figure that something like half of those are children, you've got a very small population. And essentially, the organization at Qatar University is doing surveys all the time. It's not unusual for people to say, well, I was surveyed last week or last year, I was surveyed twice. And one of the motivations for this was to look at what I call survey burden. And did this impact the way people thought about surveys and whether they were able to continue. Russell said some of this at the beginning of this talk, I just got here. But there were a lot of reasons why this was actually quite important to the country. I mean, if they're funding a survey research institute, they want to succeed. And there are hiring some people from outside the country to help them for a while, but now we've all gone. So this is information they need to do the job that the president of the university has asked them to do. As far as Egypt is concerned, we did the Arab Barometer survey in Egypt. Probably the most important thing is to say is that we left off some questions that we knew would probably get us in trouble. You always have to go through the agency that approves it. It's called CapMass. Those of you from Egypt know what that is. And so we submitted to CapMass. We worked with organizations that have trained interviewers, which is very important too. Another reason why we feel that it really has to be face to face is that every approach has its pros and cons. But I think if it's not face to face, where you can tell people that don't feel if you don't answer the question, you don't have to, and you reassure them that you're not taking notes. And there'll be some people who won't want to answer. Fair enough. But it's not as if we just parachuted in for the barometer and pay an Egyptian some money, and he or she recruited their students in this school. Yeah. So these are important questions, and we're trying to take them seriously.
Just figured I'd comment on that before we go to the next question.
And I didn't talk much about the survey attitudes portion of the project, so thanks for filling that in.
This might be too much of a stretch, but Dr. Lucas, speaking to your presentation, I'm wondering if the differences that you're seeing between the Arab and non-Arab respondents is measuring at all an underlying kind of national pride aspect in terms of the difference between kind of seeing it as like a technological advancement versus imperialism.
I think there were some of the questions in the indexes that probably could have done that, but I think there were others that were, I wouldn't see that they were measuring kind of a national pride, but rather, and I think more so in the technology index. The imperialism index, the three questions, there was some variation on those, but I think, yeah, there were, and that I think was an area where the cultural connectedness of Arab expats into kind of, Arab cultural environment, a Arab media and Arabic media environment, as compared to kind of the non-Arab expats. I think that could also be a little bit on that, but the technology, the differences are also there in the technology index. And we kind of did robustness checks, and it's not, there wasn't really any differences when we left out particular questions, so.
Thank you. Next question. I will share a question from Professor Nazitullah Javardi for Dr. Phull. And Professor Javardi had to leave. The question is, can you give us a sense of the distribution of people you talk to? For example, what percent are in the polling is a scientific camp, polling is a social construct camp, polling is an emancipatory camp? Which perspective is most common? And how does this break down by pollsters in different regions? Moreover, are there classifications mutually exclusive necessarily? Are these classifications mutually exclusive necessarily, excuse me? Can some perspectives be both socially constructed and emancipatory? For example, socially constructed and also useful for social movements?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I didn't show the breakdown because I don't have a representative kind of field, right? I'm interviewing a sample of whoever would talk to me, basically. And then there were many dynamics to take into consideration. For instance, funding and backers behind these actors, where they're located, what level they are in the hierarchy of their workplace. There were all sorts of things. And so rather than creating a kind of very comprehensive mapping, I could roughly say that 25% were the smaller subgroup was this emancipatory sort of view. It was very, it was a small emergent sort of part of the sample. The other two were roughly split, but I was looking for the underlying epistemological assumptions, and there are some worldviews there that just aren't commensurate. You didn't hear the same people with a strict scientific view speak about polling as a force for, like, as a public good, really, other than it didn't, those views didn't really align. Now, of course, I wouldn't categorize this as sort of mutually exclusive. I don't want to make it into a sort of theoretical framework, but it was more a discursive outcome of these interviews. And again, it wasn't the central premise of my doctoral research, but it was something that emerged that I thought was interesting, that needs more exploration. And it was the emancipatory view that, sure, I'm sure people within that realm would speak to maybe the social construction of other things. Maybe they are naturally constructivists, but there was something in there that spoke to the potential for this methodology and research to do something fundamentally different. So I didn't want to peg people as one of three types of subgroups of human beings, rather three approaches to understanding the practice of opinion research itself.
Thank you so much. Professor Lizardi also did say that she loved your talk and she's looking at your dissertation, so just wanted to add that as well. So, are there other questions while we wait for the projector to come back on again? It's been a long day for the projector even, so. Any final comments from our panelists?
Can I ask?
Yes, please.
You want to play rock, paper, scissors?
Well, no, it's not this is so fascinating. I think this builds on your question about maybe the research or the findings telling you something more. And I wondered about, there's something about expat, citizen, outside, inside, like out-group, in-group sort of. I don't know very well the dynamics for the people involved, but on language, on religion, and religious practice, on access to social services and whatnot, citizen versus expat, there are probably differences there. And these, perhaps your data actually says more about inside, outside. I don't know.
Well, I think actually that was kind of our initial expectation. I think one of the things to keep in mind that our sample was white collar expats. So it is not, there is a closer approximation of socioeconomics education may actually be more advanced amongst the expat sample than in the national population. So I think these are, these are kind of things that we went in kind of thinking about, that it was kind of an insider outsider, but rather that the insider outsiderness is not about citizenship, but rather about there's a cultural dimension to it. And I think that, that was the interesting thing, and I think that's one of the areas where both in terms of kind of future surveys, we wanted to build in more individual level type of questions, individualistic, communalistic values, certain, political orientations and things like that, that we just couldn't have in this particular survey. As compared, and just, being left with citizenship, and country of origin as kind of our key variables. Because of course, we weren't we wouldn't know if, say, Lebanese, Palestinian, Jordanian Christians are part of the Arab sample or not. So I think, this is why, some of the areas where we want to do both kind of future survey research, but also kind of moving into the kind of focus group area, to kind of dig at what do these meanings, or what holds in these meanings. Especially, I think we were particularly interested in doing this for citizens as well. So one of the things I wanted to ask in your presentation, and I think you sort of answered this with the kind of in the boundaries between these three approaches. But I guess, kind of what is the implication for the doing of polling and survey research, and how, okay, so I think you alluded to who's using the data and how, but I guess does it even also implicate kind of the ways that polling is done? Because of course, there's a lot of questions about data reliability, data falsification, that has come out of the Middle East lately. And so I'm just, I guess, what is the implication of these different categories for the work of doing public opinion work?
Thank you. So, yes, well, if I start with one thing that I didn't mention with the emancipatory sort of group is that in that sort of category, you found a lot of decentralized actors. So these weren't companies with strict hierarchies, with a CEO, with people down the line with roles. It's something like, I suppose, the Arab Barometer, where it's more decentralized. There's collaboration between profession, academic, local actors, external actors, and it's this decentralization of power that leads to a decentralized sort of approach to a more equalized, I guess, form of knowledge sharing and whatnot. I think it probably changes the discussion. I'd love to have more participant observation in those places and understand that, whereas the scientific sort of view did come from highly centralized, top-down, kind of learned behaviors or learned assumptions about how to do the job, how the science works. And I think this question of hierarchy, which relates very much to power, who has the right to procure data and in what ways, I mean, this is something that actually I want to flesh out in much more depth, and this is why I'd love to understand on the other side of this, what are the effects? What are the effects of doing polling differently with these different underlying epistemological assumptions? I would believe that things like transparency, access, all of that comes into effect, but also perhaps trust between publics themselves, between people and those interviewing them, maybe trust in the system or the potential for polling to do something better than just, be there. But these are all hypotheticals for now.
Very good, thank you. Other questions? Oh, we do have a few minutes. I wonder, actually, since we are getting close to the end, we still have the keynote and we have dinner. But I wanted to see if maybe Professor Lucas or Professor Suleiman, in the few minutes we have, would like to talk about looking after beyond the conference, next steps, as you like, no pressure, but just if you wanted to.
Well, okay, yeah, and we have John still with us. I don't know how you're doing this, at what time of the day it is there for you. Maybe he just fell asleep and his computer's still on. But I think also, since we are kind of giving a recording for some of the other participants who aren't here with us in the room or still online, and I think one of the ideas that we had in kind of thinking about the conference is, we didn't want to just have this as kind of a one-day thing, but rather, we are looking to develop some of these papers and hopefully try to, put this out there in, one venue or another. I think we would prefer an edited volume type of book. But on the other hand, it also may depend on, who's interested in how the papers shake out as to having perhaps a special issue of a journal. That there's a few journals that probably would be interested in that, in the conference theme itself. And so one of the things that we have been talking about is, that first of all, we have everybody's presentations recorded. The machine is captioning it as we speak, but we were going to try to run it through a better machine translation. I guess with all the AI problems, I'm not sure. We may not want to give Skynet that much information, but we were going to have the machine translate this, but also in presentations for folks. And I know some of the papers are more like developed than others in terms of their, where they are in the potential publication process. But we really would like to have, a paper from all of our presenters, to be able, and we could put them together. I think, as the day has gone on, it does seem how we've been able to, kind of have these persistent themes throughout the day. And in terms of kind of connections and as we intended, conversations across, both time, space, and discipline in some really interesting ways. So I guess, we will be in touch shortly as kind of maybe thinking about timelines. For those of you who are here, we can kind of maybe talk over dinner as to where your particular timeline is with your paper. And for those who are going to listen to this in a recording shortly, we'll be in touch with you all too, to talk about these things. So, usually in these situations, we usually put about a 6 month, kind of deadline ahead to kind of get the papers that were presented. And we will be getting people their, recordings and their transcripts as soon as they're ready. And the videos will be ready.
Yeah, it really is, as soon as people approve them. And so, if everybody approves, we could do it panel by panel, person by person, however, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that was kind of one of our future thoughts. I guess one of the other things that, for other participants but also our audience, who have been can also be active audiences, how they've interpreted things and what are some of the takeaways that you all have seen across the day. Be interested to hear from some of you on that, whether that's in a homework that's turned in next week or not. Not looking at anybody in particular here. And the extra credit. But also as well as kind of, if people had thoughts on that, I'm going to stop talking now.
Thank you so much. Any thoughts, comments? Yes.
Whole thing being recorded,
Yeah, it's all being recorded on Zoom right now.
and then it's accessible to other people who couldn't come.
Yes, so we'll see if, whoever approves, we'll post it on our YouTube page, the Muslim Studies Program YouTube page, yeah. Okay, well, why don't we take, unless anyone wants to say anything? Okay, then we will take it, we'll finish 5 minutes early. So we will reconvene at 4:45. We want to give our keynote some time to relax. Just had a long drive from Ann Arbor, so 4:45 PM, our keynote with Professor Mark Tesler, and then you're all